Dr. Lockhart, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
In anticipation of this conversation with you, I reviewed one of your books, which is titled Denmark 1513 to 1660, The Rise and Decline of a Renaissance Monarchy. And I discovered something amazing, amazing for me anyway, that tiny little Denmark, as we look at it on the map now, was at one time one of the largest states in Europe. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. It's kind of hard to believe.
Yeah. So
The, the
go ahead. I'm very curious to start by talking about what is Denmark, or what was Denmark actually, the realm and the geography.
well, and that's a good question. Of course, it also depends upon how you define Denmark within, because even the modern kingdom of Denmark, of course, the while
Even
the
within the modern kingdom?
within the modern kingdom of Denmark, the portion that we call Denmark is actually quite small, because the vast majority of Danish territory is Greenland, which which is
Oh,
which is
yeah.
part of the monarchy. Well, granted, um, it's an autonomous part of the monarchy. I mean, it's essentially self-governing and has been for several decades. Um, but the Denmark itself, the Jutland Peninsula and the two main island groups, the central island group around the island of Fyn and the eastern island group around the island of Sjælland, which is where Copenhagen is located, and the island of Bornholm further east in the Baltic, are quite small, because that's where the vast majority of the population is located.
Which is
Now,
about 5 million or so, right?
yeah, I think it's about that. It's probably about that right now. I'm guessing
Yeah.
that, yeah. And because the disproportionately large portion of that is in Copenhagen itself, which is
Yeah.
a world-class city, but it's not a. It's I used to drive across Denmark a lot, and especially when working in Jutland, and
Uh-huh.
with the bridges with the bridge built over the Great Belt between the island of Shetland and Fyn, it's a 3.5 hour drive to get from one end of Denmark to the other. It's really quite
Wow. Wow.
it's really
So,
short.
yeah, very small. So, let's talk about the other geographical uh, parts of Denmark now. You mentioned Greenland and some of the islands in the peninsula, in the
Right.
Baltic region itself. Any more?
Well, currently, well, yeah, the Faroe Islands. I mean, currently, the Faroe
Oh,
Islands,
okay.
which were Iceland, were a holdover from Denmark's former rule over Norway. Yeah, both Faroe Islands and Iceland were Norwegian vassal states. And when Denmark lost Norway in 1814, it held on to those. Iceland um, was a separate monarchy within the Danish monarchy for a time until 1944, of course, when Iceland set up shop on its own, and it's been a sovereign nation since 1944.
I like how you describe that set up shop on its own.
Yeah.
Yeah. um, so let's go back to the original sort of question, the all
Mhm.
moment that I had. Again, one of the largest states in Europe. When was that?
At the really at the height of its power, which would have been roughly the early part of the 16th century to the middle of the 17th. I mean, this is the point at which Denmark had claimed some significance as not just as a great regional power within the Nordic Baltic section of Europe, but also as a major player on a European stage, and a major actor, front rank actor, really
Wow.
in the late 16th, early 17th centuries. And that's one of the reasons I started doing Danish history, because this was, I'd gone to Purdue to study military history with Gunther Rothenberg, and I was fixed on the 18th century. And very first book I read on the 30 Years' War, first year I was an undergraduate, talked about Denmark's role in the 30 Years' War, and it never occurred to me until I read Cicely Wedgwood's book on the 30 Years' War that Denmark ever actually wielded any kind of influence. I knew it was Sweden,
Yeah,
just
yeah.
office, but wasn't aware of Denmark. And so this was, my mind was blown, and I immediately just pursued it from there. And that's Denmark is largely overlooked in the grand narrative we have of pre-modern Europe.
Of course, yeah, it blew my mind when I read that passage about being one of the largest states in Europe. You said something that I wanted to go back to.
Mhm.
You mentioned Norway. Uh, Talk to me about this a little bit. Where Norway and or Sweden at one point sort of a collective sovereignty
Yes,
with Denmark?
yes,
How? Yeah,
in,
I'd love
in
to hear.
several in several different points. Of course, understand before I go into that the cultural and linguistic similarities between Denmark, Norway, and Sweden are much, much greater than the differences. Um,
Oh,
that it's possible Danes and Swedes can understand each other's languages with some difficulty, but um, the last names of the leading families of the realm in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, for much of the early modern period, are the same. I mean, they're essentially the same families.
oh
Um,
wow.
so there's a lot in common there, despite modern day stereotypes about how often Norwegians and Swedes say that Danes speak like they have potatoes in their mouths, or that the language is a pathological condition of the larynx rather than an actual language. The a lot of that's just friendly local
Who says
rivalry.
that about whom? Swedes say
About the
that about.
Danes, and
uh,
the Danish language is not enunciated anywhere near as clearly as Norwegian or Swedish, so that's
Oh,
the
that's so funny.
reasoning
Okay.
behind that. I remember in fact, I was thinking when I very first time I visited Copenhagen in 1988 as a graduate student working on my dissertation, I saw a poster that reads, I wish I'd taken a photo at the time, keep our city clean, escort a Swede to the ferry. Um, that the FERRY, the ferry to Sweden.
Oh, okay, okay, okay,
Because a lot of Swedes would
okay.
come over, for less expensive beer
Yeah, yeah.
in Copenhagen. So anyway, despite all that, there's really a lot similar between the three, and the history of one is so invariably caught up with the history of the others. So where it comes specifically to Denmark as a political entity, two things in particular that are especially important. One of them is the Kalmar Union, which is formalized in 1397. The Kalmar Union is, which is brought to be under Queen Margrethe the First, the for whom almost the recent queen was,
Named.
shares the name, yes. Um, and that lasts formally until Sweden essentially forcibly ejects itself in the 1520s. But it's a personal dynastic union. In other words, it just simply was a matter of the sovereign of Denmark was also the sovereign of Norway and the sovereign of Sweden.
Kind of like
Not three
inherited
states.
the realm.
Yes, in other words, they're still three separate states. But
Oh,
kind
okay.
of like Scotland and England, when James Stuart becomes King James the First of England, he's still King James the Sixth of Scotland. I mean, they're two
Yeah,
separate roles, and it doesn't
yeah,
mean
yeah.
that the states are actually unified.
Or like when William the Orange of Orange or something like that became king of England as well, but he still had the
Right,
Netherlands.
right. Still had it as a separate
Yeah,
identity, really.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Now the Union falls apart there in the 1520s, but the 1520s, 1530s are a major period of consolidation and transition in all the Scandinavian realms, but especially in Denmark. There's a civil war in the mid 1530s, referred to as the Count's War, where the heir apparent from the ruling Oldenburg dynasty fights a civil war to maintain control of his realms, and at the same time introduces the Lutheran faith. This is where Protestantism
Lutheran
officially
faith.
begins in Denmark, officially. But part of that transition is that Sweden is gone, but Norway is still tied to Denmark, and in fact, its reluctance to embrace the man who will become King Christian III in 1534.
King of
Uh,
Norway or king of
he's King of Denmark, but
Denmark? Okay.
also he perceives himself that certainly as King of Norway. Is that he makes himself King of Norway in fact as well as in theory. And in fact, under Danish rule initially, the historians very often refer to this union as being Denmark-Norway, and it's not exactly accurate. because Norway is reduced as a punishment for not immediately accepting the king to the status of a province. So it has no more
Oh,
constitutional standing than Jutland or
oh,
Finland.
wow.
Yeah. And the administration in Copenhagen rules it all. So from that point until Denmark declined significantly in the 1650s and 1660s, late 1650s in particular, the kings of Denmark rule Denmark itself. They with a question mark where it comes to the southern border. I can return to that. Norway was more than modern Norway. There are a couple of provinces that are taken away from Norway by Sweden later on. So it's a really large Norway. The southern tip of modern day Sweden, the provinces of Blekinge, Helland, and Skåne, which was probably the wealthiest part of Sweden, the best farmland in all of Sweden, was under Danish rule. And with Norway came Iceland and the Faroe Islands. So there's a whole lot of territory there. Plus, the Oldenburg kings of Denmark were also German princes, and Christian III, who becomes king between 1534 and 36, was also Duke of much of what today we call Schleswig and Holstein. So Denmark, the kings of Denmark ruled a pretty big chunk of German territory, plus modern day Denmark, plus a big, probably the most valuable part of southern Sweden, and all of Norway and Iceland and the Faroe Islands.
I want to talk to you about how Denmark became so powerful and then how it lost all that power. But before we go there, let's talk about Denmark's dynasty,
Sure.
which was on the news recently when Queen Margaret abdicated, and now Frederick X is their king. As I understand it, Denmark's royal family, correct me if I'm wrong, is the longest uninterrupted monarchy in Europe.
Yeah, so no, the royal family has changed a couple of times, but the monarchy itself has gone uninterrupted since at least as far as we can tell, from the reign of Gorm den Gammel, Gorm the Old.
When was that?
Middle of the 10th century.
So we're talking 900s.
Yeah.
How is that different, let's say, than England? In England, you had the parliamentary rule for some, oh gosh, 10, 15 years, I guess, where Charles I was beheaded in the middle of it. Yeah.
And then the protectorate under Cromwell.
Exactly. So is that a sort of thing that you would categorize as interruption?
Yes, they're interregna, and then Denmark doesn't really have an interregnum in its history. It's fairly, there's a couple of rough successions, but they're not they're nothing substantial. Certainly nothing that can compare to the Commonwealth and Protectorate in England.
Did Denmark's royal family, and I know there are several different dynasties based on what you just shared with me, did they ever mix with royal families of other cultures or?
Oh yeah. And of course that's kind of the norm, isn't it, where it comes to European royalty and throughout the pre-modern and modern eras. Couple in particular, England, where there are several English consorts in Denmark and Danish consorts in England. Prince George in the late 17th, early 18th centuries, and in England, and well, I'm drawing a blank on what I was going to say. Greece, of course, is another one, and they're recent and older. One of the sons of Christian IX, in fact, becomes Prince George of Greece. Prince Wilhelm in Denmark, Prince George in Greece, who rules until 1913 when he's assassinated. And one of the youngest daughter of Frederick IX, Margaret's father, was in fact married the last king regnant of Greece until the monarchy was abolished there.
Interesting. Greece had the royal ties to a lot of countries, including
Yeah,
to
including
England.
Denmark.
Yeah. So
Now, with Denmark, in fact, so Christian IX, who was king from 1863 until 1906, a good long length of time, had the nickname the father-in-law of Europe because his children were all married, almost all his children married off into royal families.
um, when in the case of Denmark, when you marry someone, when the royal family marries someone from Greece, uh, we're going to get into religion later, but I'm just wondering, Denmark being decidedly Protestant, and then let's say you bring Orthodox Christians from Greece, does that create issues?
It doesn't create issues in Denmark. I'm trying to remember. I honestly can't remember Margrethe's sister, I'm drawing a blank now. Anne Marie of Greece.
Uh-huh.
I can't remember what her personal arrangement was in Greece in terms of
I
religion.
see.
But it certainly doesn't. Denmark is a pretty secular and open society
Especially
with
in modern
regards
era.
to religion. Oh yes.
Um, my last question on the dynasty of Denmark royalty is this: I read somewhere that Denmark had elected monarchy.
Yes.
Do I have that correctly?
Yes.
What does that mean?
Well, until 16. Well, the last elected monarch is Christian IV, who's king during the 30 Years' War. His son and successor, Frederick III, is also elected, but he also imposes the royal law of 1661, which creates the hereditary monarchy. What it means is this, and it really stems from because a lot of things in Danish royal tradition, including the informality and the approachability of the dynasty as it exists today, because clearly the Danish monarchy is a somewhat different atmosphere to it than, say, the British.
Yeah.
That these things stem from very old Germanic tribal the conditions of Germanic tribal chieftains in late antiquity. That there's a certain amount of egalitarianism there and approachability, and where it comes to election, again, this is kind of following old Germanic and Viking trends that kings are elected, but not by the populace at large. You're not
Yeah,
talking
yeah,
about overall election, but rather by the leading aristocrats of the realm.
Is it
Uh,
similar to how the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had elected kings for some time?
it seems to be a little bit less fraught with instability as
Exactly.
the
That's why I
Polish.
asked that question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are rarely big issues. I mean, there are for example, by the 17th century, by the 16th century, the election is almost a formality. In other words, it's already pretty much decided. The Danes have already settled on hereditary succession, um,
Oh,
and
I see.
the eldest son very often is pre-elected as while still quite young. Before adolescence even. And then they're given the title the elected prince, as opposed to duke, which is a title that most younger Danish royalty
Yeah.
would have. So they're already kind of slated for this, and the election itself, which precedes the coronation, is kind of a formality. But there's a couple of important caveats there. One of them is that it can be a point of contention, and this is, for example, in the 17th century, the transition to the succession of King Frederick III, the son of Christian IV, because the aristocracy was very upset with his father. They had him in a very difficult position because Christian IV, eldest son, predeceased Christian IV, and so the aristocracy found an opportunity to extract some concessions if you want your second son elected. Uh,
Oh, interesting.
so there's
Again,
a
the point that you're making is that this is not a democracy. This is not popular
no,
elections. You made the point. You said the word aristocracy several times. So this is essentially the lords and the barons, what have you, whatever
yeah,
those
it's,
names
it's a
are.
couple dozen people just
There you go.
electing.
Exactly. We'll be back after a short break to talk about Vikings and Denmark's military power. Dr. Lockhart, What role did Denmark play in the Viking Age?
Um, that's a good question. I'm not sure how to answer it in that way, except that
Okay.
the Viking Age is a critical point in Danish history because it witnesses two major developments there. One of them is the creation of Denmark as a monarchy, because up until that point, like much of Germanic Europe that had been beyond the beyond Roman horizons in late antiquity, Denmark and the Scandinavian lands and England, for that matter, are kind of a chaotic jumble of competing Germanic groups.
Hmm.
With Denmark, it seems to be that under the really in the height of Viking power in the eighth, ninth and tenth centuries, especially, that we see actually some centralization. In fact, Gorm the Old really is part of this, is part of the Viking Age, and it's during that time that we see uh, Denmark as a Viking kingdom, creating something like an empire for the first time, and in particular, its incursions into England in the 10th and 11th centuries. So this is a critical time. Um, the the other development besides the creation of the monarchy is the introduction of Christianity, which happens primarily under Gorm the Old son. Remember, he's not the first king of Denmark. He's the first king of Denmark that we can positively identify. There's a legendary, the succession of legendary kings before him.
Like mythical?
Well, not so much mythical as that they're attested to by foreign sources that had fleeting contact with him, and you don't really know from the Danes themselves, from
Oh, I
written
see.
records, what the political situation was really
Your
before
primary
they.
research sources don't come from Denmark
Right,
itself, they come from other
right,
nations that
like
interacted
like
with
from
them.
Charlemagne, from Carolingian contacts, for
There you
example,
go.
with the Danes.
The Franks, the
So
French.
we know about Frankish contacts with kings in what would be Denmark. As to what the extent of their authority was, we really can't say very well.
I see.
Um,
I wanted to get some clarification on something you said. You said the Viking Age did two things. The second thing that you said was religion, but the first thing that I want to ask you about is you said establish monarchy, and this is when Denmark was becoming an empire, and they encroached into England. As I understand it, they even ruled parts of England or all
yes,
of it for some time. Um, how do I ask this question? What I want to know is, was that an empire, sort of a well-established empire with bureaucracy and institutions, or was it more like tribal warriors conquering lands?
it's more like that. It's more like the
Yeah.
latter. It's more like it's an outpost, and certainly
Okay.
nobody. I don't think anybody could accuse the early Danish kings of having any kind of significant functioning bureaucracy.
I see.
Not until somewhat later in the Middle Ages when that definitely does emerge. Um, so yeah, the term empire there I should have practically put in quotes. I mean the Danes are ruling over lands that are not Denmark, even if only fleetingly.
Yeah.
It's not an empire in the way that we would perceive an empire in the 16th century or certainly in the 19th
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
20th.
And there are a lot of, and this is not exclusive to Danes. For example, Attila the Hun established an empire, but it went away. Or
Yes.
Tamerlane had an empire. Many of these very powerful warriors established such a quote unquote empires. So let's go back to your book again.
Mhm.
Denmark 1513 to 1660, the rise and decline of a Renaissance monarchy. So when did Denmark become a major military power?
It would be the mid to late 16th century. And all it was building as soon as Christian III, the king I was mentioning, who brought in Protestantism formally in when he is the last man standing at the end of the so-called Counts War in 1536. Um, with Christian III's accession in 1536, there's a definite shift in power dynamics within the Danish state. I mean, the king wields a lot more authority than he had before. Partly this is a function of Protestantism, because the king has essentially claimed all lands that once belonged to the church, and the church has become the spiritual, servant of the monarchy. Especially Lutheranism was a huge boon, to ambitious monarchs. It really allowed them the opportunities to grab power that they hadn't been able to do before. And we certainly see this at work in Denmark, where the king goes from being a minor landowner to the major landowner. But with Christian III, Christian III overtly tried to avoid entanglements on the European continent. After all, he was German in language, by birth, and by inclination, but he tried to steer clear of the religious wars that were already starting to brew in the Holy Roman Empire and elsewhere on the continent. However, it's during his reign that Denmark begins to build up a significant fleet royal, for example. It's under Christian's son, Frederick II, who becomes king in 1559, that we see Denmark beginning to throw its weight around, and in a couple of capacities. One of them is as a power broker in northern Germany. Because, again, Danish kings saw themselves also as German princes. They just happened to have the resources of a kingdom behind them, so they could play those territorial games a lot better than other German princes could. And Denmark will continue the next century to build up its base of client states and of its own territorial possessions in northern Germany. The other thing that Frederick II does is get involved in European religious wars, and in politics of the Holy Roman Empire, and then in these attempts that center. It's very well known for Elizabeth I of England. It's not so well known for Frederick II. These attempts that center really on England and Denmark and the Netherlands to create kind of a Protestant international, if you will, following the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent, within the history of the Catholic Church, is, I'm sure is a major point of consolidation to recover from the damages inflicted by the Protestant Reformation.
Yeah,
and the perception of the Catholic Church as aggressive, as bent on destruction of Protestants, in fact, extermination of Protestants, is what compels these attempts at a Protestant alliance. They never really fully work out. But this is the concern that Frederick II has, is the creation of an alliance with the Dutch and the English and with German Protestants to combat what they see as Catholic aggression.
Okay, let's talk about several concepts that you brought up. You said Denmark throw its weight around, power broker, client states, let's see, combat other nations. And as you were saying, using these terms, the whole while I was thinking, how did Denmark get the resources to do this? How did it rise to power? Could it be in something that you said earlier? You said king wielded more authority because of the church. Did all of a sudden the king become more authoritarian and could call up more Danish people to come and serve in the army? I'm speculating there.
Well, that's definitely one aspect of it.
Okay.
Just the fact that the king does not quite have to kowtow to the aristocracy as had been the case before. Now that dynamic is not gone entirely, because certainly Christian IV will have a lot of headbutting with his aristocracy during the 30 Years' War. But the king definitely has a lot more executive authority where it comes to, for example, building a fleet. Although generally speaking, aristocrats weren't opposed to fleets. They didn't see fleets as something that could be used as an instrument of royalist oppression, right?
Yeah.
Arms can do that, not so much fleets. Fleets are kind of safe, and fleets are good for commerce, right? So there's that. But the other thing is, Denmark is really at this point beginning to profit in a very big way from its wonderful geopolitical situation, because this is the thing. This is really the key to understanding Denmark as a great power. It controls the Sound. It controls all the maritime passages between the North Sea and the Baltic. In particular because it controls the southern part of Sweden and, of course, controls the Danish islands. And any ship passing from the North Sea into the Baltic is either going to have to go through one of the so-called belts, which are even more restrictive between the Danish islands, or through the Sound, which is the narrow passage between present-day Sweden and Denmark. All you have to do is put a few forts on either side of the Sound, and you've closed it off.
Yeah.
The Danish kings learn that they can control the Baltic trade, which is arguably one of the most important trade routes, if not, certainly the most important in Northern Europe, in the 16th and 17th centuries. And this is where most of Northern European grain comes from Poland and East Prussia and from Muscovy. So the Danish kings learn they can turn on and turn off the Baltic trade as if they had their hand on a faucet. And the couple of things about that, first of all, of course, it kind of forces them into having to play a role in international politics, because unless you want to just leave the Sound open, every European state that does business in the Baltic is going to be jealous of you or court your support, and this leads to a lot of confrontations with the English, with the Dutch, even with the Spanish, for example. But
all of whom had armadas. They had their own merchant ships and armadas. Yeah.
Yes, and Denmark did too. It kind of had to at this point. I mean, I think it's arguable that by 1570, 1580, the Danish fleet was the equivalent of the Elizabethan fleet.
Oh, wow.
In size and in sophistication. It doesn't get a lot of press, but Denmark is up there at the top of Northern European naval powers.
Oh, wow.
So how it remained that way really through the 17th century. But I'm sorry to interrupt. I want to make my second point before I forget it. The other thing, of course, that comes from the for control of the Baltic is that the Danish kings quickly decide to turn this into a money-making venture, and so we have the so-called Sound dues, which are collected from the end of the 15th century until the 1850s, so that any ship passing through the Sound at Helsingør, what most English speakers know as Elsinore, where Hamlet takes place.
Oh, interesting.
The Kronborg Castle at Helsingør is where those dues are collected. And they vary from time to time. Some nations pay more, some nations pay less. Some sensitive goods like gunpowder, for example, might demand a pretty high fee. But this money goes directly to the king's coffers, not to Denmark's, but to the king's. And it means that Danish kings have a tremendous amount of wherewithal. Christian IV, king of Denmark, from 1596 to 1648, the king during the 30 Years' War, is generally considered to be the wealthiest individual sovereign in all of Europe in terms of his access to cash reserves coming from the Sound dues. So in other words, they not only are forced into a confrontational position with other European powers, they have cash, lots and lots of cash.
Again, the king, the monarch, him or herself. And I could see how aristocrats wouldn't really care much about that.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not coming. So how did it all fall apart? How did it decline? I mean, I know it's several hundred years of history, but I'm just curious here.
What happens in a flash, though? I mean, it really does happen in a flash.
In a flash, okay.
I think Denmark you could make the argument that in 1600, Denmark is Europe's leading Protestant state, period. I mean, I realize that probably ticks off a bunch of Tudor historians or Stuart historians, but you just pay much attention to diplomatic interchange at the time. The King of Denmark Denmark is accorded a significance and a degree of power that we don't see any other time in its history, but definitely is in the front rank, seen as the leading Protestant power. And so when Christian IV goes to war in 1625 in the 30 Years' War, he's regarded as kind of a natural champion for the Protestant cause. But flash forward to 1645, and Denmark is already looking like it has been, and its position has been
from 1625 to 1645.
Yeah, and reasons for that. First of all, Denmark's defeat in the 30 Years' War, because it is defeated, does set the monarchy back somewhat. It also creates a situation where the king and his aristocracy are somewhat at loggerheads. There's definitely a constitutional crisis going on in Denmark in the 1630s and 1640s. In the meantime, Sweden, a lot of this has to do with Sweden rather than Denmark. Sweden has moved up in terms of its potential for wielding power dramatically and kind of quietly. Of course, Sweden had been on its own since the 1520s and had been fighting for its life against a slew of enemies that surrounded it. Muscovy, Poland, Denmark, the Hanseatic League occasionally, and with virtually no wherewithal. I mean, Sweden was a poor country, period.
Yeah.
Very little resources. But among other things, the Swedes not only developed a certain hardness and toughness, I think, that was that contemporaries remarked about a lot. It was Count Waldeck who said something, I can't remember the exact quote, but the Swedes are a cold and hungry people, and the Swedes are a hungry people, and consequently they are cold and hard-hearted. And so there's that, learning how to make do with very little. But also under Gustavus Adolphus, I mean, it's easy to. I mean, it's become fashionable, I think, to minimize what Gustavus Adolphus manages to accomplish. But Swedish military institutions go from being, capable of holding off the Poles mostly to a world-class fighting force, both at sea and on land.
Yeah, we actually had an episode about the history of Sweden, and it's amazing how, with limited resources, they essentially became an empire for several decades, and in a flash themselves also.
And with a unity between king and ruling class that Denmark doesn't have at the same time, which is a huge disadvantage for Denmark.
I didn't follow that. Say that again, please.
Okay, in Sweden there is a unity between king and ruling elite.
Okay, like
that doesn't exist in Denmark.
Yes, yes.
And so it's kind of even when Gustavus Adolphus is gone, even when it's Axel Oxenstierna as acting as regent for Queen Christina, even when it's Queen Christina ruling by herself, there is a unity of purpose there, a shared mission between the monarchy and the aristocracy that we don't see in Denmark.
Yeah.
And so when and Christian IV, he overextended himself. I mean, there's definitely that. One thing I pointed out the money issue, of course, that the Danes certainly had the cash resources to hire mercenary armies and to build a navy, but Denmark doesn't really have a lot else. I mean, it's a reasonably prosperous rural economy. I mean, farming is better in Denmark than it is in Norway or Sweden. It doesn't really have a lot of natural resources per se. I mean, the silver and iron resources at Kongsberg, for example, in Norway haven't really been developed significantly, and they're not as good as what Sweden has. The one advantage, and it was an advantage that Denmark had, is one of the few European states that could make its own gunpowder without having to import anything, because through Iceland, it had one of the largest supplies of sulfur in the world.
Oh,
so the Danes don't have to import anything to make gunpowder, which is good.
Yeah.
But basically, Denmark does not have the sinews of a great power, and a small population. I mean, if you count all the lands under the rule of the Oldenburg kings at the height of its power, you're looking maybe 1.25 million total.
Oh my goodness! Wow, that is tiny.
Yeah.
We'll be back after a short break to talk about religion and religious wars, which we mentioned in the earlier segment. We'll be right back. Dr. Lockhart, I have several questions about religion in Denmark. The first question, simple one, I just want to know, you mentioned this, if you would remind me, please, when did Denmark adopt Christianity?
Well, formally 1536, 1537. Christianity. I'm sorry. I'm thinking way ahead of you chronologically.
That goes to the heart of my question. I know how you're about to clarify it. Go ahead. You're referring to Protestantism, right?
Yes.
There you
and
go.
Lutheranism in particular. But
Lutheranism.
Catholic Christianity, that's under the reign of Harold Blotand, who probably better known for a variety of reasons that become obvious as Harold Bluetooth. Where we
Okay.
get the name of the technology, in fact.
Oh, really? That's
Yes,
where the
yeah,
name comes from.
that comes from that. Yes. So Harold Bluetooth converted to Catholic Christianity, and
When was that?
this would have been it's
Just
late in the 10th century.
okay.
Um, that he manages that. And Denmark is pretty thoroughly Christianized by the end of his reign. A good relationship with the church, one that didn't necessarily pay off immediately in political dividends to Harold, but by and large, it was a boon. I mean, it gave him connections with the Holy Roman Emperor and with the papacy and its power and wealth that the Danes did not have while they were pagans.
Okay. Um, I I have just a curious, fun question to ask here.
Yes.
If you said the Bluetooth technology came from Harold, the Bluetooth's name. What's the connection?
I'm trying to remember what it is. It's come up in a few news stories. If you Google it, you'll see it. And
I will, and I will actually include it.
I would have looked it up myself beforehand.
No, that's
I
just
don't know about that.
fascinating, really funny. So let's go to Denmark's Christianization. I'm not talking about how it became Protestant, Lutheran specifically
Right.
In the 16th century. I'm going back to the 10th century when Harold the Bluetooth became Christian, and then during his reign, Denmark was thoroughly Christianized.
Yes.
When you say that, what does that mean? How does a population go from being pagans to being Christian? Is that, you read about these stories of how Charlemagne brutalized people and pagans and Christianized them, and that's how the Pope loved Charlemagne and all of that. Is that how it is, or were Christian missionaries already in Denmark?
Christian missionaries already in Denmark, and I think overall, I mean, this is at least the evidence doesn't seem to suggest a great deal of intimidation or force.
Okay.
That this was readily accepted. So it's pretty smooth. I don't, where it comes to the mechanics, say at the the level of the individual missionary, I couldn't tell you with great detail.
But no, you answered my question. My question was essentially about that, whether or not it was a state sort of forced process, or is this just sort of smoothly happen?
Well, Harold definitely gives his imprimatur on this, and it's something that was very important to him personally.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems to have been taken up within a generation or two pretty quickly. And I'd say it's probably less traumatic than at least some aspects of the Protestant Reformation.
You've written a book titled Frederick II and the Protestant Cause, Denmark's Role in the Wars of Religion, 1559 to 1596. This book's period, identified in the title, sort of caught my attention because I know of the 30-year war. We discussed it in the last period, which sort of began the decline of Denmark. It entered the war in 1625 with all sorts of promises and glory.
Yes.
And then by 1645, it already was sort of a has-been.
Yes.
So I know about the 30-year war to some extent. I don't know what you mean by religious wars of 1559 to 1596.
Well, here I'm talking about the civil wars that become international wars, primarily in France and the Netherlands. So in France, this would be the so-called wars of religion that start with the death of King Henry II in 1559. Probably the most famous episode from that is the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in August of 1572.
Oh yeah.
So that's there's multiple French wars of religion until the Henry IV proclaims the Edict of Nantes, and Protestantism is tolerated. We go back to more religious wars in the early 17th century during the time of Richelieu. But the period that's most fraught is that a period from the early 1560s to the late 1580s, where the French monarchy is actively trying to establish its primacy within France at the same time that it's dealing with both contentious Catholic nobles and with the Huguenots, with French Protestants who were struggling for survival.
And this had international reverberations. Like reading about Elizabeth I, they were worried about these wars and all the persecution of the Huguenots who were going to England, actually,
Yes.
flee. Yes. So how does
They see
Denmark?
this as part of a big Catholic papal conspiracy. I mean, that's typical of the age.
Of
It's
the
not just
age,
a
okay.
matter of a domestic issue. This is part of the agenda of the King of Spain and the Pope,
Yeah,
and they want
yeah.
to exterminate Protestants.
So how does Denmark play a role in all of this?
Well, Frederick II very much bought into that belief. And that partly came from the fact that, unlike his father, he was very interested in continental politics and deliberately immersed himself in German politics, for example. Um, he had close relationships with a number of German Protestant princes, and he believed too. And of course, he saw evidence of this within his own
He
land.
believed what, in the Reformation cause?
Believed in the idea that there was a Catholic conspiracy to
Oh,
subjugate Protestant Europe. It's funny. It sounds the language sounds a lot like domino theory when it comes to communism during the Cold War. If France falls, then it's going to be the Netherlands. Then it's going to be the Protestant German states. Then it's going to be us. So we better stop them now. And
so it wasn't immediately affecting his realm, his immediate realm, but
no.
this was sort of preemptive.
Yeah, yeah. And understand too that again, this is getting into the complexities of late 16th century diplomacy, which is why I love dealing with.
Yeah.
The overall perception that, especially because it's very easy for Lutherans to portray the Pope as the Antichrist, or for Catholics to portray people like John Calvin or Martin Luther as the Antichrist. This feeling that we are living on the edge of the actual apocalypse, that this is the end of days, and that the
Wow.
opposing force is in fact the forces of the Antichrist, and you better be on the right side, right? when we're looking at the end of time.
Do you appreciate how crazy it sounds when you say they called the Pope the Antichrist?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating. All right, let's take a break here. Stay with me and Dr. Lockhart as we get into the perspective. Dr. Lockhart, how do Danes view their own history now?
It was a really interesting question. It was something that was kind of a surprise to me when I first started going to Denmark to do work there. And a very interesting conversation I had with a owner of an antiquarian book dealer in Odense. And I was trying to find a bunch of obscure volumes dealing with 16th and 17th century financial history. And he said, I'm curious, if you're an American, why would you find any of this interesting? The interesting history is where you live. And there's this, and I found this again and again, except from professional historians in Denmark, is they really didn't think their history was all that interesting.
Really?
There was that. Now, don't get me wrong. There are plenty of Danes who find their history to be interesting, and the fact that there are so many physical reminders, for example, of Christian IV. You go around Copenhagen, there's a building that was designed by Christian IV or built under his reign, practically every street corner.
Yeah.
But nothing wistful, nothing really sentimental. Even where it comes to
I'm surprised, huh?
the collapse of empire, because the Danes had, besides their early modern empire, they did have kind of a scattered 19th, 20th century empire, the Danish West Indies, the Virgin Islands, of course.
Yeah.
Plus colonies in Sri Lanka and in Africa. That this is the fact that Denmark was once an imperial power like other European states is more of a matter of, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, but nothing, no wistful yearning for a day when Denmark was great. And
does that surprise you?
I guess not in the context of 1864. And the year 1864 is such tremendous repercussions for Danish society, culture, and politics. Incidentally, I don't know if you run into there's a Danish miniseries. I think the most expensive production in Danish TV history came out a few years ago called 1864.
What is 1864?
The Second Schleswig War, the war between Denmark, Prussia, and Austria, the first of the German wars of unification, where Denmark was, taken down a really big notch by Bismarck's generals and by
Yeah.
the Austrians, and lost a fair chunk of its territory in the southern part of Jutland, some of which they got back in 1920 after a plebiscite after World War One. But 1864 was a big slap in the face and was a national humiliation, but also a very cold reminder that Denmark isn't all that anymore. Now we look back at this from the perspective of the 21st century, and it looks ridiculous. Why would Denmark actually go to war with Prussia and Austria? Well, in the perspective of 1864, it doesn't look that ridiculous. Denmark had a decent army; it wasn't very big, and its navy was definitely better than anything the Prussians or the Austrians could put together. Plus, the Danes really believed that the Swedes and the British would help them out. And of course, neither came to pass. But that 1864 moment is kind of the realization that we're a small state. We're a small, unimportant state.
Oh, wow.
And that from that point on, just the notion that Denmark was once a major power, regional or European, still is one that I think a lot of Danes don't quite accept.
Interesting.
It was a lot bigger.
Are there? Don't. I chuckle at the question I'm about to ask you, Dr. Lockhart, but I'll ask it anyway. Are there any lessons from Danish history for us Americans?
Well, I mean, there's one of the obvious ones. Obviously, is the transience of power, right? I mean,
Yeah.
And granted, Denmark, the basis of power is a pretty fragile and tenuous one from the beginning. But just that notion that it is just as it's hard to believe that Denmark could have been a great power looking at from our perspective. I imagine it was pretty hard to imagine Danes not being able to concede that they wouldn't be a great power from the perspective of 1600. And that's to me an important consideration. In a more contemporary political sense, to me, Denmark is a perfect example of why organizations like NATO actually serve a vital function in the world today.
Amen. Yeah.
Denmark has been a very eager and pretty dedicated member of NATO.
Yeah. Was it a founding member?
Pardon?
Was it a founding member?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
The fact, though, that it's hard to imagine a state like Denmark being able to survive without without NATO acting in a way like Mac Walker once said about the Holy Roman Empire as an incubator. Something that allows a lesser states to survive and thrive, and Denmark's contributions to the world in terms of in culture and sciences and the arts are not insignificant.
Yeah, of course. If you wanted our audience to remember just one point about Denmark's history after everything we've talked about, what would that be?
That's a really good question. I think and again, this is sort of perspective of an historian, that it's important for us to understand the past from the perspective of the past. And what I mean here in particular is that, one of the reasons that we don't talk much about Danish history or that much about Swedish, if it weren't for Michael Roberts, nobody would talk about Swedish history at all.
Yeah.
Or Polish history, is that these are states that have as failed as great powers. And that, I think to ignore that is to kind of skew our notion of how states and how societies expand and contract. If we were just to look at European history, as so many of my predecessors have done, I think in the field, from the viewpoint of England, France, Germany, or Britain, France, Germany, that we have a hard time understanding that as if this is a matter of fate, right? As if
it was inevitable, right?
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Interesting.
And I think looking at failed states that sounds bad. And looking at failed powers, actually is one way of combating that.
That's a wonderful point to end our conversation. Dr. Lockhart, thank you so much for educating me and our listeners And to our listeners, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much for having me.